Ruth Fletcher arrived in Granger's Hollow, Texas, on the hottest afternoon of August 1878 with nothing but a leather trunk, $32 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and a cast-iron determination that she refused to let anyone mistake for desperation. The stage had barely rolled to a stop outside the general store before the driver tossed her trunk down into the red dust without ceremony, and Ruth stepped out of the coach with her chin lifted, and her eyes already scanning the sun-bleached street for any sign of a man named Gideon Bailey, who had posted a notice 3 weeks prior in the San Antonio Ledger seeking a temporary cook for his cattle ranch through the duration of the fall roundup season. 6 weeks of work. Fair wages. Room and board provided. Inquire at the Hollow Post Office. Ruth had not been looking for adventure when she read that notice. She had been looking for survival. At 26 years old, she had spent the last 8 months watching her life dismantle itself with extraordinary efficiency. Her father had passed in December of the previous year, leaving behind a mortgaged farmhouse and a stack of debts that swallowed every dollar she had saved. Her intended, a soft-spoken schoolteacher named Marcus Webb, had quietly informed her 2 months after the funeral that he did not feel the arrangement between them was practical any longer, given her reduced circumstances. She had not cried over Marcus. She had cried over the farmhouse briefly, and then she had folded her grief into something smaller and set it aside the way you fold a quilt and slide it under the bed. She had taken work at a boarding house in San Antonio, cooking breakfast and supper for 12 men every day of the week, and she had been good at it, better than good. But when the boarding house owner's nephew arrived from Georgia needing a position, Ruth found herself with 2 weeks' notice and the classified pages spread across her narrow bed. Gideon Bailey's notice had been the one that made the most sense. 6 weeks, real wages, a clear end date. She had written to the post office address, received a brief but businesslike reply confirming the position and providing directions, and here she was. A boy of perhaps 12 was sitting on the general store steps whittling a stick. Ruth approached him with her most practical expression. "I am looking for the Bailey Ranch," she said. "Can you point me in the right direction?" The boy looked up with the slow, assessing gaze of a child who has learned that strangers in small towns are either interesting or trouble. "The Double B," he said. "That's Gideon Bailey's place. You going out there to cook?" "I am," Ruth said. "He sent Walt Dawson into town this morning to wait for you." "That's Walt right there." The boy pointed down the street to where a weathered man in his 50s sat on a buckboard wagon outside the saloon, hat tipped low against the sun. Ruth thanked the boy and walked to the wagon, introduced herself to Walt Dawson, who had the slow, polite manner of a man who had worked the same land for so long that he had taken on its steadiness. He loaded her trunk without fuss and helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they set off down a dust road that wound south through mesquite brush and rolling grassland for the better part of an hour. "What's Mr. Bailey like?" Ruth asked, once the town had shrunk behind them and the land opened up in every direction. Walt squinted at the road. "Good man, fair man, works harder than anybody on his own spread which his hands respect. Lost his regular cook, Mabel Hooper, when she went to care for her sister over in Abilene. Roundup season's coming and he's got 14 men to feed 3 times a day. He's not difficult, Miss Fletcher, just busy." "Busy I can manage," Ruth said. The Double B came into view as the afternoon shadows began to lean east. It was a proper ranch, not a small operation. A large main house built of Texas limestone sat at the head of a long yard, flanked by a bunkhouse, a barn that could shelter 30 horses comfortably, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a cookhouse that stood separate from the main house with its own chimney already breathing a thin thread of smoke where someone had banked a fire earlier in the day. Beyond the buildings, the land rolled outward in all directions, and Ruth could see the distant movement of cattle on a far hill, a dark shifting mass under the wide sky. A man was crossing the yard when the wagon pulled in, and Ruth knew without being told that this was Gideon Bailey. He was tall without being rangy, built like someone who had earned his width through labor rather than inherited it. He wore dusty boots and worn denim trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hat was the color of old straw. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two either side of it, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in November, a deep gray-green that Ruth noticed immediately because they were the kind of eyes that looked directly at a person rather than past them. He helped her down from the wagon with a steady hand and released it the moment her feet were on the ground. "Miss Fletcher," he said, "I'm Gideon Bailey. I hope the journey wasn't too hard." "It was long," she said honestly, "but I am here and ready to work." Something in his expression shifted slightly, as though he had been prepared for a complaint and received a pleasant surprise instead. "Walt will show you the cookhouse and your quarters. I've got the pantry stocked for the week. I'd be obliged if you could have supper ready by 6. The men come in hungry." "How many are we feeding?" she asked. 14 hands during roundup. "Plus yourself and me if you're willing." 16, she said, already calculating. "I'll have supper on by 6. He nodded, and that was the whole of their first conversation. The cookhouse was better than she had expected. Someone had cleaned it before her arrival, and the iron stove was a large, well-maintained model with 4 burners and a reliable oven. The pantry held sacks of flour, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, sugar, coffee, and 2 crates of canned tomatoes. A cool cellar beneath a trap door in the floor held potatoes, onions, and several crocks of preserved goods. Ruth stood in the middle of the cookhouse and felt the first honest sense of possibility she had experienced in 8 months. She made beef and bean stew that first night, with cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet and a pot of strong coffee. She had biscuits ready on the side because she had learned early in her life that men who have worked outdoors since sunrise will eat anything, but they will be quietly devoted to whoever gives them biscuits. The hands came in sunburned and loud, and they went quiet when they smelled the food, which Ruth had always found to be the most satisfying sound in any kitchen. They ate with the focused appreciation of working men, and when she brought out a dried apple cobbler that she had put together from the pantry stores, one of the younger hands actually stood up halfway from the bench before catching himself and sitting back down. Gideon Bailey ate at the end of the long table nearest the door, which she suspected was habit rather than distance. He ate without complaint or particular comment, which meant he was either indifferent or genuinely satisfied, and when he brought his tin plate to the wash bucket at the end of the meal, he paused by the stove. "That was a good supper, Miss Fletcher," he said. "Thank you." "You are welcome, Mr. Bailey." He set his hat back on his head and went out into the dark, and Ruth began washing dishes in the lamplight, listening to the distant sound of cattle and the closer sounds of men settling into the bunkhouse, and she thought that 6 weeks was a manageable thing. She revised that thought carefully over the days that followed, because the 6 weeks were not what she had anticipated, but the reason for her revision was not the work. She had known the work would be demanding. 3 meals a day for 16 people, with the nearest full supply run 2 hours away by wagon, required planning and creativity and an unflinching relationship with the pre-dawn darkness. Ruth was up before 5 every morning to start the breakfast fire and have coffee, eggs, bacon, and biscuits on the table by 6:30. The midday meal was simpler, often delivered to the men in the field during roundup in a wagon, and supper was the largest production of the day. What she had not anticipated was Gideon Bailey himself. He was not what she expected a ranching man to be, and she recognized, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that her expectations had been assembled from a limited collection of experiences. The men she had known had been her father, who was gentle and bookish, Marcus Webb, who was agreeable but thin in his convictions, and the various boarders at the San Antonio house, who ranged from decent to forgettable. She had not known a man who moved through his days with such quiet, deliberate purpose. Gideon Bailey was on his land before sunrise every morning and rarely came in before dark. He did not raise his voice to his men, but they listened to him the way horses listen to a calm rider, with complete attention. He knew every corner of his spread and every animal on it, and when one of his younger hands made a mistake with a gate latch that cost them 2 hours of cattle gathering, Gideon simply fixed the problem and explained once, calmly, how to do it correctly, and that was the end of it. He also appeared in her cookhouse, uninvited, on the 4th morning of her tenure, while she was in the middle of trying to get the oven temperature right for a batch of bread. "You need a different kind of wood for that stove," he said from the doorway, and Ruth startled so hard she nearly dropped the bread pan. "Mr. Bailey," she said, pressing a hand to her sternum. "Sorry," he said, and he looked genuinely sorry about it. "I should have knocked, but that stove runs cooler with mesquite. You want oak or cedar for a proper oven temperature." "There is only mesquite in the wood pile," she said. "I know. I'll have some different wood split and brought over. In the meantime, you can run it about a quarter longer than you'd expect." Ruth looked at him with something that was not quite irritation, but was adjacent to it. "You know your stove's limitations, but you stocked only the wrong wood." He had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "Mabel Hooper had a particular way with it. I suppose I assumed anyone would adapt." "Anyone will adapt," Ruth said, turning back to her bread. "But it is useful information to have at the start." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I should have told you. I'll have cedar delivered this afternoon." She turned to look at him and found that he was entirely serious, not defensive, not dismissive, just straightforwardly acknowledging that she was right. It was disarming enough that she softened. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not burning the bread while we talked about it," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corner of his mouth. The cedar arrived that afternoon as promised. By the end of the first week, Ruth had established a routine that suited the ranch's rhythms and her own considerable organizational capacities. She knew which hands preferred their coffee black and which took sugar. She knew that Domingo Reyes, the most experienced vaquero on the ranch, had a dietary preference that avoided pork due to his Catholic observances on Fridays, and she accommodated it without making a production of the accommodation. She knew that young Pete Callahan could eat more than men twice his size, and that old Walt Dawson had a bad tooth that made chewing difficult on his left side. She knew these things because she paid attention, and because feeding people well was, in her view, not just a job but a form of care. Gideon noticed. She was not entirely sure when she began to realize that he noticed, but it was sometime in the second week, when he paused beside her during the midday meal delivery to the southern pasture, and said, quietly enough that the hands around them could not hear, "You remembered that Domingo doesn't eat pork on Fridays." Mabel used to forget every single week. "It was mentioned in passing," Ruth said, lifting the cloth on the food wagon to check that everything had survived the journey without spilling. "Most people don't retain what's mentioned in passing," he said. "I find that retention is largely a matter of whether you consider the person worth remembering," she replied, and then she was slightly alarmed at herself for saying something so direct, but Gideon Bailey was not alarmed at all. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes in a way that was neither invasive nor indifferent, and nodded once, as though she had said something he would consider later. He did consider it later. She was quite sure of that. The third week of her tenure coincided with a stretch of genuinely brutal weather. A late summer storm rolled in from the southwest on a Tuesday, dropped 3 inches of rain in 18 hours, and turned the ranch yard into a river of red mud. The cattle were unsettled. 2 of the hands came down with what appeared to be fever from spending too long in wet clothes, and the main house roof developed a leak over the parlor that required buckets. Ruth discovered the leak because Gideon mentioned it, offhandedly, at breakfast, and then 2 hours later she had exhausted her morning's work faster than expected due to the rain keeping the hands inside where they could eat at the table rather than out on the range, and she found herself with an unexpected hour of unstructured time. She went to the main house, which she had not been inside before, knocked, received no answer, and knocked again. The door drifted slightly open on its own, because the latch was poorly fitted, and Ruth could see the bucket sitting in the middle of the parlor floor under a steady drip from the ceiling. She looked at the drip, at the bucket, at the gap visible between the parlor ceiling boards where the water was working through, and she did something she would later describe to herself as practical rather than presumptuous. She found a rag in the kitchen and put it under the front edge of the bucket to angle the collection, moved a small table that had gotten splash damage, and then, noticing that the front step was pulling away from the house foundation due to the rain, she went and found Gideon's tool box in the barn and hammered the step back in place before the gap could worsen. She was washing her hands at the cookhouse pump when Gideon came in from the south pasture in his rain slicker, looking like a man who had been arguing with the weather and losing. "What were you doing in the barn?" Walt Dawson asked him as they walked past, because Walt had seen her come out with the tools. Gideon looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back. "The front step was coming loose," she said. "I secured it before the rain worked the gap larger." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. "You fixed my front step." "It was going to be a significant repair if it was left through the rest of the storm," she said reasonably. "It was a 15-minute job today, and it would have been a 2-day job by Thursday." He took his hat off and pressed his hand briefly to his forehead in a gesture that she was coming to recognize as the one he made when he was genuinely, unexpectedly affected by something. "Miss Fletcher," he said, "I hired you to cook." "You hired me to cook," she agreed. "The cooking is done, the bread is proofing, and the step needed to be fixed. It seemed wasteful to stand idle in the middle of a problem." He put his hat back on. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you," and went to change his clothes, and Ruth went back to her bread. That evening, after supper had been served and cleaned up and the hands had drifted to the bunkhouse, Gideon came to the cookhouse door while Ruth was preparing her list for the next week's supplies. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. Ruth looked up. The offer was slightly unexpected since the coffee was in her kitchen, but she understood that it was an invitation rather than a request. "I have the pot on," she said. He came in and sat at the small table she kept in the corner for her own meals, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him. The rain was still tapping at the cookhouse roof. The lamp made a warm circle in the middle of the dark. "How is it going?" he asked. "Honestly. Is there anything you need that you haven't got?" "A second bread pan would help," she said. "And if you can get me dried chilies from the mercantile in the next supply run, I can make something better than the stew I've been rotating." He produced a small notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote it down. "You carry a notebook," she observed. "I forget things otherwise," he said. "The ranch generates more details than my memory can hold without assistance. What sorts of things do you write down?" He glanced at the notebook, then at her, as though deciding whether the question was idle or genuine. "Cattle counts, rainfall measurements, what I owe the men, what the land needs." He paused. "Things I want to remember." "That is not forgetting," Ruth said. "That is simply organizing. There is a difference." He smiled then, properly this time, not the corner-of-the-mouth suggestion she had seen before, but a real smile that changed the whole geography of his face, and Ruth felt something shift inside her that she had no intention of acknowledging out loud. They talked for an hour that evening, about the ranch and its history, about the land, about the coming roundup and what he hoped to sell in the fall markets. He had bought the Double B 6 years earlier with money borrowed from his uncle and earned through 3 seasons of trail driving from Texas to Kansas, and he had spent 6 years building it into something self-sustaining. He was proud of it in the way that people are proud of things they have built with their own hands, not boastful but quietly certain. Ruth told him about San Antonio, about the boarding house, about her father's farm. She did not tell him about Marcus Webb. That story felt like a bruise she was not yet prepared to press. When the lamp began to run low, she said she should let him get to sleep, since the work started before sunrise. He agreed, rose, set his cup in the wash bucket rather than leaving it on the table, and told her good night. She watched him cross the dark yard to the main house and went to bed with the strange feeling that she had had a conversation that she wanted to have again. They began to talk in the evenings with increasing regularity. It was not a planned thing, and neither of them named it as a thing. It simply happened that after supper was cleared and the hands were settled, there was often an hour before full dark in which the cookhouse was quiet and Gideon Bailey found his way to it, sometimes with a question about supplies, and sometimes without any stated reason at all. Ruth learned that he had grown up in Tennessee and come west at 17 with his uncle, a cattle driver of the old school who had died 3 years back of pneumonia. She learned that he had a sister in Amarillo named Clara who sent him letters with more frequency than he managed to reply to them. She learned that he had tried to grow a kitchen garden the previous spring and lost it entirely to a late frost, which he mentioned with the sheepish frustration of a man who could manage cattle and land and men but had been defeated by tomatoes. "You planted too early," Ruth said. "So I was told afterward," he said. "What did you plant?" "Tomatoes, beans, tried some squash." "Next spring, wait until the soil holds warmth overnight," she said. "You can test it by leaving your hand flat on the bare ground. If it feels warm in the morning, plant. If it feels cold, wait another week." He wrote it down in his notebook. "You're adding gardening instructions to your cattle notes," Ruth said. "Useful information deserves to be written regardless of the category," he said, and looked at her over the notebook with an expression that had become increasingly difficult for Ruth to interpret in a simple way. She stopped trying to interpret it in a simple way sometime during the 4th week. It was a Sunday afternoon, which was the closest thing to rest that the ranch permitted. The hands had Saturday night and Sunday afternoon service in town, and most of them made the ride in for church and socializing. Ruth generally used Sunday afternoons to do the deep cleaning that the week's pace did not allow, and to prepare anything that needed long cooking for Monday. Gideon did not go to church in town. He had told her once, neutrally, that he attended a circuit preacher's service when the man came through, which was 3 or 4 times a year, and that he managed his spiritual accounting in the meanwhile on his own. Ruth respected this because she felt similarly. Her own relationship with the Almighty was private and honest, and she had little patience for the performance that sometimes accompanied public worship. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Ruth was in the vegetable garden that she had begun to cultivate in the space behind the cookhouse, which had previously been nothing but hard dirt and dry grass. She had found seeds in the general store on the last supply run, and had spent 2 Sundays working the ground with a borrowed spade. And now, she had neat rows of early greens and late-season herbs beginning to show themselves in the turned earth. She was crouching between the rows, pulling weeds with the focused attention that weeding requires, when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Gideon standing at the garden edge with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was something open and slightly wondering. "You made a garden," he said. "Behind the cookhouse," she said, as if the location required clarification. "The soil here is better than I expected. There is a clay layer under the first foot, but the topsoil is decent if you work it." He crouched down at the edge, looking at the rows with genuine interest. "What is this?" He pointed to a cluster of seedlings. "Parsley, and those are thyme. The broader leaves there are going to be charred if the rabbits leave them alone. I put down some barriers, but I have not yet had an opportunity to build a proper fence." "I'll build you a fence," he said immediately, and then seemed slightly surprised that he had said it that way, without qualification or condition. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You have more pressing things to attend to during roundup." "Sunday afternoons I generally don't," he said. "And a fence is not a long job if you know what you're doing." "Do you know what you are doing with a fence?" she asked. He gave her a look that was dry as August. "Miss Fletcher, I have fenced approximately 400 acres of Texas rangeland. I can manage a kitchen garden." She laughed. It came out before she could moderate it, a real laugh, unguarded, and Gideon Bailey looked at her as though the sound had surprised and pleased him in equal measure. He built the rabbit fence that afternoon. Ruth brought him water and eventually a slice of the gingerbread she had made from the last of the fresh molasses, and they talked while he worked, the easy companionable talk of two people who had run out of polite surface topics and arrived at the more interesting territory beneath. She told him about the farm she had grown up on, about her father's hands in the garden soil, about learning to cook from her mother who had died when Ruth was 11 and left her to manage a household at an age when most girls were still playing. She did not offer this as hardship, simply as fact, because it was what had made her capable, and she had long since made her peace with that. He listened with the quality of attention that she was learning was particular to him, full and without distraction, as though whatever she was saying was the most interesting thing in his immediate environment. "Did you want to stay on the farm?" he asked. "After your father died?" "I wanted the farm to be viable," she said. "It was not. Those are different things." "What would you have done with it if it had been?" She thought about it honestly. "I think I would have run it, found a way to make it work. I am not someone who gives up on a thing easily." "No," he said, looking at the fence post he was tamping into the ground. "I don't believe you are." The fence was sound by the time the sun reached the tops of the mesquite trees, and Gideon stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has completed a useful task. Ruth stood beside him and looked at the garden enclosed neatly within it. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. They stood there for a moment in the cooling afternoon air, close enough that she could see the dust on his shirt and the angle of his profile against the wide sky, and Ruth was aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that she had not felt this comfortable in anyone's company in a very long time. She was also aware, with a clarity that was more uncomfortable, that she was here for 6 weeks, of which 4 had already passed. The awareness arrived fully in the 5th week, like a weather change you can feel before you can see it. She was in the midst of the roundup's busiest stretch. The men were bringing cattle in from the far ranges, sorting them, branding the new calves, preparing the herd for the fall drive, and the work was relentless from before sunrise until well after dark. Ruth was cooking for the whole operation, and sometimes delivering food to multiple locations in the same day, with the help of a second wagon that Gideon had arranged. She was exhausted in the good way, the way that comes from doing necessary work well, and she was also increasingly aware that the end of this particular work was approaching, and that the approaching end felt less like relief than she had expected. It was Domingo Reyes who first said what was apparently visible to the men, although they were all too polite or too wise to say it directly. Domingo was 40 years old, had worked cattle since he was a boy in Chihuahua, and had the serene perception of someone who had spent decades reading animals and weather and people in order to survive. He appeared at the cookhouse window on a Wednesday morning while Ruth was rolling out biscuit dough and said, "Miss Fletcher, you are leaving in 8 days." "That was the arrangement," Ruth said. "Gideon is going to hate that," Domingo said, with the unconcerned directness of a man who has earned the right to say obvious things. Ruth did not look up from her biscuits. "Mr. Bailey hired me for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks is nearly done." "Yes," Domingo said. "That is what I said. He is going to hate it." He moved away from the window, and Ruth rolled the biscuit dough a little harder than strictly necessary. The conversation that actually changed everything happened on the Thursday of the 5th week. It was evening, late enough that the hands were in the bunkhouse, and a dry thunderstorm was moving through, lighting the sky in the east without offering any rain. Ruth was on the cookhouse steps with her cup of chamomile tea, watching the distant lightning, when Gideon came across the yard and sat on the step below her without asking, which by this point did not require an invitation. They watched the lightning for a while without speaking, which was another thing they had found comfortable between them. "I got a letter from Clara today," he said eventually. "Your sister," Ruth said. "What does she say?" "She wants to come visit in October." She's been asking to see the ranch for 2 years, and I've kept putting her off because the timing was never right." He turned his cup in his hands. "I was thinking that October would be a good time. Roundup will be done, the weather will be cooler." "That sounds fine," Ruth said. "She'll want someone to talk to," he said. "Clara talks a great deal. She finds me unsatisfying as a conversational partner on the subjects she prefers." "What subjects does she prefer?" "Anything domestic, gardens, recipes, the management of a household." He paused. "She's been telling me for 2 years that I need someone to manage this house properly." Ruth kept her eyes on the lightning. "Are you suggesting I stay on to entertain your sister?" "I'm suggesting," he said slowly, in the manner of a careful man working his way toward a difficult thing, "that the reason I keep finding myself in your kitchen in the evenings is not because I'm hungry." The lightning lit the eastern sky in a bright pale flash, and Ruth let the silence after it stretch for a full moment before she said, "What is the reason then?" He turned on the step to look at her, and in the low light from the cookhouse window she could see that the careful composure he generally maintained had been set aside. He looked earnest and slightly uncertain and entirely sincere. "You fix things," he said. "Not just the step, not just the fence. You see what needs doing, and you do it without waiting to be asked and without requiring recognition. You cook food that makes my men feel like they're cared for, which is not nothing out here. It is not nothing at all. You built a garden behind my cookhouse in the time between other work, and you didn't ask permission because it was obviously the right thing to do. You tell me the truth without cruelty. You laugh when something is funny." He paused. "I don't want you to leave in 8 days, Miss Fletcher. I want to ask if you'd consider staying." Ruth set her cup down carefully on the step beside her. She looked at this man who had turned out to be entirely different from the brief advertisement she had answered, who had turned out to be someone she would not have invented for herself, because she had never had enough imagination to invent someone this specific. "Staying to cook," she said, carefully. "Initially," he said, equally carefully. "Staying to cook and staying to tend the garden and staying to talk in the evenings." "Staying because I would like to see what else you fixed that I haven't noticed was broken yet." He held her gaze steadily. "I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean, Miss Fletcher, and I am not saying this because Roundup is ending and I need a cook. I am saying this because I have been trying to think about October, and I cannot think about October without thinking about whether you'll be in it." Ruth looked at the lightning for a long moment. She thought about the $32 in her petticoat hem, considerably reduced now that she had spent some of it on garden seeds and a few personal necessities. She thought about the boarding house in San Antonio and the classified pages spread across her narrow bed. She thought about her father's hands in the garden soil. She thought about a man who built rabbit fences on Sunday afternoons and kept a notebook so he would not forget things worth remembering. "I would need to know what you are actually offering," she said. "Not in vague terms. I do not make decisions on vague terms." He looked at her with something that was respectful rather than startled. "Room and board continuing. Wages commensurate with the work, and the work would be negotiated together, not assumed. And I would like the opportunity to court you properly, if you are willing to allow it. I am not a man who moves quickly on important things, but I am also not a man who mistakes his own feelings when they become clear." Ruth was quiet for a long time. The dry lightning moved north. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, cattle and insects, and the distant voice of one of the hands singing something slow in the bunkhouse. "I will stay through October," she said at last. "On those terms. And we will see." "That's fair," he said, and the relief that crossed his face was so genuine and unguarded that Ruth had to look away from it because it made something ache in her chest in a way that she did not entirely know how to manage yet. In the morning, she did not feel foolish about what she had agreed to. That was how she knew she had answered honestly. She wrote a letter to the San Antonio boarding house explaining that she had found other employment. She wrote another letter to a cousin in Galveston whom she had been considering approaching for temporary lodging, explaining that the plan had changed. Neither letter was difficult to write. which was also useful information. The last days of the official roundup season passed with the particular momentum of work reaching its natural conclusion. The herd was sorted and counted, the fall drive was organized, and 6 of the 14 hands rode out with the cattle on a Friday morning, heading north. The remaining 8 were the permanent ranch crew, men who stayed through winter and formed the steady core of the Double B's operation. On the first Saturday after the temporary hands departed, the ranch felt quieter in a way that was not empty but settled. Ruth cooked supper for 9 instead of 16, and found the smaller number almost conversational, the men talking more freely around the table without the noise and press of the roundup crowd. Gideon sat at his usual place at the end of the table and ate with the slightly loosened posture of a man who has been braced for months and can now stand down from the bracing. He looked tired and genuinely satisfied, the face of someone whose hard work has produced the outcome it was meant to produce. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, he came to the cookhouse door and stood there with his hat in his hands, which Ruth had noticed was a gesture that appeared when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "The cattle drive is away," he said. "The roundup's done. I have a proposition." "Another one," Ruth said mildly, not looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. "A different kind," he said. "Tomorrow being Sunday, I thought if you were willing, we might ride out to the south pasture. There's a point on the creek where it bends that I've been meaning to show you because it's the prettiest place on the property and you've been here 5 weeks without seeing anything but the yard and the delivery route." Ruth set down the pot. "You want to take me riding?" "I want to take you to the creek bend," he said. "The riding is incidental. I have not ridden in several years," she admitted. "I have a horse that would suit you," he said. "She's easy and smooth-gaited. You would not need to do anything complicated." Ruth considered him for a moment. He was standing with an air of careful hopefulness that she found entirely without pretension, the hopefulness of someone who wanted something and was not ashamed of wanting it, only uncertain of receiving it. "What time?" she said. He smiled. "After breakfast is cleared, we'll take a packed lunch." She packed the lunch herself, which was perhaps predictable: bread and sliced salt beef and pickled cucumbers, and 2 slices of the apple cake she had made on Friday from dried apples that had reconstituted more successfully than she had expected. She put it in a canvas sack and met Gideon at the barn at 8:30, where he had saddled a gentle roan mare named Bess for her and his own gray gelding. He helped her mount without fuss, and they set out south across the ranch land, moving at a comfortable walk through the dry grass that had gone the color of old honey in the late-season heat. The sky was deep and cloudless, and the air had that particular quality that Texas air has in September, hot still, but with an edge to it that suggests autumn is coming to somewhere nearby, even if it has not arrived here yet. Gideon pointed out features of the land as they rode: the old water tank his uncle had dug, the far line of hills that marked the property boundary, the place where a creek ran underground in summer and came back to the surface in fall. He spoke about the land with the quiet passion of someone who has learned to read it the way others read books, who knows its moods and tendencies and what each change in color or sound or smell is telling him. Ruth listened and watched the landscape and felt herself unclenching from something she had not fully known she was clenching. The creek bend, when they reached it, was everything he had suggested it might be. The creek had come back to the surface with the early fall rains and ran clear and quiet over smooth stones, shaded on both sides by a cluster of cottonwood trees, whose leaves had begun to turn the first pale yellow. The bend made a small pool where the water stilled before continuing downstream, and the whole place had an atmosphere of enclosed peace that was remarkable on a landscape that was otherwise entirely open and exposed to the sky. They tied the horses to a cottonwood and sat on a flat rock at the water's edge. Ruth unpacked the lunch and Gideon poured water from the canteen he had brought, and they ate in the shade with the sound of the creek and the cottonwood leaves, which have a distinctive rustling sound unlike any other tree, a soft papery trembling that Ruth had always found beautiful. "You come here often?" she asked. "When I need to think," he said, "or when I need to stop thinking. It serves both purposes." She looked at the water moving over the stones. "What do you think about when you come here to think?" He looked at the water, too, for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The future, the ranch, what I'm building it toward." He paused. "For a long time I was building it as a thing in itself, something that could stand on its own legs and prove that it was worth the effort. I think sometime in the last year or two I started wondering what it would be worth the effort for if it's only ever mine alone." Ruth let that settle before she responded. "You want a family," she said, "not a question." "I want what my uncle never had," he said. "He drove cattle his whole life. He built things and left them to me because there was no one else to leave them to. I respected him, I loved him, and his life was full in its own way. But I think he was lonely. I think loneliness became so habitual to him that he stopped naming it as loneliness and just called it the life of a ranching man." He looked at her. "I don't want that. I want someone to have dinner with at a table, not at the end of a bunkhouse bench. I want someone who will tell me when I'm wrong without cruelty. I want a garden that someone tended because she thought it was worth tending." Ruth looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him from the very first day when he met the wagon, and she said, "Gideon, you said you wanted to court me properly. I told you I needed specifics, not vague terms. So let me be specific with you in return." He gave her his full attention. "I came here to work," she said. "I came here because I needed to survive, not because I was looking for anything else. I was not looking for this. But I have been honest with myself for long enough to know when something is happening that I did not plan, and I am too practical to pretend otherwise." She took a slow breath. "What you described at the cookhouse door last week, what you want, I think I want those same things. I have wanted them quietly for long enough that I had almost convinced myself I was not allowed to want them anymore, because the one time I reached for them, they were taken away." She told him then about Marcus Webb. She had not intended to, but it came out in the direct way that things tend to come out in places where the air is clear and the water sounds honest over the stones. Gideon listened without interrupting, and when she had finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was a fool. He was a practical man making a practical decision," Ruth said. "There is nothing practical about leaving someone like you," Gideon said, and the simplicity and certainty of it was so different from how she had expected him to respond that she felt her chest tighten with something she was not going to call grief, because it was not grief. It was the opposite of grief. It was the sensation of a wound deciding it was done being a wound. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, taking the longer way around, and talked about things that were lighter and easier. He made her laugh twice more, and she noticed that he was the kind of person who became visibly pleased when he made someone laugh rather than merely satisfied, as though the laughter was the point and not the cleverness that produced it. October arrived, and so did Clara Bailey, who came on the stage from Amarillo on a Wednesday morning, and was exactly what Gideon had described: a bright, warm, energetic woman of 28 with his coloring and a much more expressive face. She embraced her brother before she had fully stepped down from the stage, which he received with the self-conscious affection of an older sibling who loves his sister very much and is moderately embarrassed about the expressiveness of it. Clara turned to Ruth and assessed her with eyes that were the same gray-green as Gideon's but quicker in their movement, and said, "You are Ruth Fletcher. Gideon has mentioned you in every single letter since August, which for Gideon constitutes something approaching a fusion." Gideon looked pained. "Clara." "It's true," Clara said cheerfully. "He said you fixed the front step, and I thought, Gideon has finally met someone sensible. Show me the garden." Ruth showed her the garden. Clara approved of it with the enthusiasm of someone who understands gardens and has been waiting to talk to someone else who understands them. She stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time she managed to be simultaneously Gideon's beloved sister and Ruth's first genuine friend in the state of Texas. Clara had married a hardware merchant in Amarillo 2 years prior and was expecting their first child in the spring. She was unambiguously happy about this and slightly overwhelmed, and she talked to Ruth about it the way women talk when they have found someone safe to talk to, freely and honestly, and without the need to perform confidence they did not feel. "Gideon is very settled with you nearby," Clara told Ruth on the second evening, sitting at the small cookhouse table while Ruth mixed a pie crust and the lamp burned between them. "He is always settled, but this is different. He has been unsettled in himself for a long time, even when he looks calm. I am his sister and I can see it. Since August he has been genuinely settled." Ruth kept her hands in the flour. "He is a good man," she said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "He is." "Are you going to keep him?" Ruth looked up. Clara's expression was fond and direct, and contained not a shadow of judgment, only curiosity and the slight urgency of a woman who loves her brother and wants good things for him. "That is," Ruth said carefully, "a matter that is still being worked out between us." "Then I hope it gets worked out," Clara said, and returned to the letter she was writing to her husband, and Ruth returned to her pie crust, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening. It was Gideon who said something about it, on a night near the end of Clara's visit, when the three of them had sat on the main house porch after supper, and Clara had gone to bed early, citing the particular fatigue of early pregnancy that she said was less like being tired and more like being made of wet sand. Ruth and Gideon sat in the porch chairs with their coffee, looking at the Texas stars, which were outrageous in their quantity on a clear October night, excessive and magnificent, as though the sky was trying to demonstrate something. "Clara likes you," Gideon said. "I like her," Ruth said. "She is easy to like." "She asked me this afternoon," he said in the careful voice he used for important things, "whether I was going to make a fool of myself or do something sensible." Ruth looked at the stars. "What did you say?" "I said I was working on it," he said, "at my own pace." "What is your pace?" she asked. He turned in his chair to look at her. The starlight and the faint glow from the house window gave her enough light to see his face, and what she saw there was the open, earnest expression she had been seeing more frequently in the past weeks, the expression that was neither performance nor pretension, but simply the truth of what was happening in him. "I think about asking you every day," he said quietly. "I think about asking you, and then I think that it has only been 2 months and that you came here for 6 weeks and that maybe I am asking more than is reasonable." "Asking what?" Ruth said, though she knew. He took a slow breath. "To stay, not temporarily, to stay here on this land in a permanent capacity, as my wife, Ruth." "That is what I mean." The stars were outrageous in the sky above them, and the night sounds of the ranch were all around them, and Ruth felt the full weight of what was being offered, which was not small and not casual, was in fact enormous in the way that the things that change the whole direction of a life are enormous, and she sat with it for a genuine moment rather than answering from the first feeling that reached the surface. The first feeling was yes. The second feeling was yes. The third feeling was the kind of careful, deliberate, honest yes that a practical woman who has been disappointed before offers when she is certain, and she was certain. "You are not asking more than is reasonable," she said. "I have been here long enough to know the difference between the impression of something and the reality of it. What I know about you is real, Gideon, the man who writes things down so he will remember them, the man who built a rabbit fence on a Sunday afternoon, the man who looked at me the first day and decided I was worth paying attention to." She looked at him steadily. "I did not come to Texas looking for a life. But a life is what appears to be in front of me, and I am not foolish enough to walk away from that on principle." He leaned forward in his chair, crossed the small distance between them, and took her hand in both of his, the careful, deliberate gesture of a man who has thought about doing something for long enough that when he finally does it, every movement is conscious. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," Ruth said, and the certainty in her voice surprised even her with its completeness. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was so unguarded that it almost hurt to look at directly, the expression of someone who has wanted a thing carefully and quietly for long enough that the receiving of it is overwhelming in its reality. Then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that was utterly at odds with the size and roughness of his hands, and entirely in keeping with the man she had come to know. "I'll get you a ring," he said. "We can go to town Saturday." "The ring can wait," she said. "But you might want to tell Domingo before he figures it out on his own and feels cheated out of being told." Gideon laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, and Ruth thought that she would spend a considerable portion of her life trying to produce that sound, because it was one of the best things she had encountered in 26 years of living. Clara wept in the morning when she was told, happy tears that she dismissed as pregnancy sentiment, but that were clearly not only that, and she embraced Ruth with a warmth that was both genuine and anticipatory, the embrace of someone who has wanted a sister and has just been given one. Domingo was told at breakfast, in front of the whole crew, because Gideon was not a man who made announcements he was ashamed of. He simply said, at the table, that he intended to marry Miss Fletcher, and that he hoped the crew would join him in welcoming her as the permanent mistress of the Double B. Walt Dawson started clapping first. Domingo looked at Ruth with an expression that was not quite "I told you so," though it was its close neighbor, and raised his coffee cup in a small, dignified salute. They were married in Granger's Hollow on a Saturday morning in November, in the small limestone church that served the town's various denominations on a rotating circuit preacher schedule. The autumn light came through the plain glass windows at an angle that made the inside of the church look lit from within, and Ruth wore the best dress she had, a deep blue wool that she had bought in San Antonio on a good week before everything fell apart, which she had carried in her leather trunk as a reminder that good weeks were possible and should be dressed for. Gideon stood at the front of the church in a clean black coat that fit him properly, which Ruth suspected was a relatively rare occurrence, and when she came up the aisle on Walt Dawson's arm, because Walt had volunteered for the honor with a gruffness that made it clear he felt strongly about it, Gideon looked at her with the same expression he had worn on the porch the night she said yes, the unguarded, overwhelmed, genuine expression of a man who has been given more than he expected. Clara was there, making her slow, careful way back from Amarillo specifically for the ceremony, and she stood in the front pew with a handkerchief she had apparently brought for the purpose. The vows were the old traditional ones, spoken slowly because the preacher liked to give them room to breathe, and when Ruth said "I do," she meant every syllable of it with the total commitment of a woman who does not give her word lightly and knew exactly what she was giving it to. When Gideon said it, he was looking at her the whole time, not at the preacher, and his voice was steady and sure. The crew threw a supper at the ranch that evening. Walt had made a pot of chili that could have fed twice the number present. Domingo brought out a guitar and played, and one of the younger hands danced with Clara in the ranch yard under the November stars until she begged off laughing and sat down. Ruth danced with her husband for the first time, there in the yard by the cookhouse, which seemed exactly right to her, and he danced well, which she had not expected but probably should have, being a man who did most physical things with quiet competence. Life at the Double B after the wedding had the quality of a thing that has settled into its right arrangement. Not that everything was easy, because nothing in ranching is easy, but that the difficulty was shared in a way that made it manageable and even, in certain lights, satisfying. Ruth continued to manage the meals and the house and the garden, which had come through its first frost better than expected. She also took over the ranch's household accounting, which Gideon had been managing from his notebook with an efficiency that was admirable and a legibility that was not, and she established a proper ledger system that made the quarterly expenses and income clear at a glance. Gideon looked at the first completed ledger. She presented him with the expression of a man who has been handed something that makes his life measurably easier and is not sure how he existed without it. "You didn't mention accounting," he said. "You did not ask about accounting," she said. "I noticed the notebook system had some organizational challenges." "Some," he agreed. with the dry understatement that she had come to find one of his most appealing qualities. She wrote to her cousin in Galveston in December, the first real letter she had sent since the brief explanation in September, and described her situation with a plainness that contained no embellishment because the truth was sufficient. She wrote that she had married a ranching man in Texas, and that she was well and settled and happier than she had expected to be. Her cousin wrote back in January expressing simultaneous disbelief and delight, and Ruth kept the letter in the small box she maintained on her side of the bedroom for things worth keeping. Winter on the Double B was a revelation. She had expected ranching winters to be a period of relative quiet, but they were in fact a period of different work: the daily maintenance of livestock in cold weather, fence repair, equipment preparation for the spring, and the ongoing feeding of 8 men who were still present and still hungry regardless of the temperature. The kitchen garden went dormant under the frost, and Ruth turned her attention to planning what she would expand it to in spring. She and Gideon spent several evenings at the table in the main house with seed catalogs and graph paper, planning the expansion with the combined seriousness of two people who understand that growing food is not a hobby but a practical necessity, and that the pleasure of it is not incidental. "We could put in fruit trees along the south fence," she said, pointing to the sketch she had made of the property. "Apple and pear, if we can get good stock. They take 3 years to produce, but then they produce for decades." "I'll write to a nursery in Austin," Gideon said, looking at the sketch. "Clara mentioned a reliable one. And I want to try asparagus this year," Ruth said. "It takes 2 years to establish, but then it comes back every spring without replanting." "You think in long terms," he said, not as a criticism but as an observation. "Permanent things require long thinking," she said. He looked at her over the sketch, and the look contained a warmth that still, after 3 months of marriage, occasionally made her slightly breathless if she encountered it unexpectedly. "They do," he agreed. Spring arrived in stages, as it does in Texas, tentative and then suddenly overwhelming. Ruth planted her expanded garden in March, with the apple and pear stock that had arrived from the Austin nursery, and the asparagus crowns, and a new row of tomatoes that she waited until the soil held warmth to plant, pressing her hand flat on the bare ground each morning until the day she felt it and knew. She told Gideon about the tomatoes when she planted them. She told him something else that same morning, standing in the garden in the pale spring light, turning to face him where he was leaning on the garden fence watching her work. "I think we are going to need to think about a larger household," she said. Gideon looked at her in the way he had when she said yes on the porch, the utterly unguarded expression. "How much larger?" "1 more," she said. "In about 7 months, if I am calculating correctly." He came through the garden gate, which he was careful about because the gate was her gate and he respected that, and he stood in front of her and took her face in both his hands the way she had imagined, in the most private part of herself, that someone might do someday when something important was being said. "Ruth," he said, with such simplicity and depth that she felt it all the way down. "I thought you should know before the tomatoes," she said, because she was still Ruth Fletcher, which was to say Ruth Bailey, and practicality and sentiment were not opposed in her but ran together in the same current. He kissed her in the garden among the tomato seedlings and the asparagus crowns and the apple trees that were already showing their first small leaf buds, and if there was anyone in the yard to see it, neither of them particularly minded. Clara's baby arrived in March, a boy named Thomas, and Clara's letter describing the birth was full of wonder and exhaustion, and the specific joy that Ruth was beginning to recognize from the inside. The joy that comes from making something real that was previously only imagined. Ruth wrote back with careful advice about what had helped her own tiredness and what hadn't, and about the asparagus coming up, and about the tomatoes that were thriving, and she mentioned at the end that Clara should plan a return visit to Texas in the fall because there would be something new to meet at the Double B. Clara's reply came back by return post, and contained mostly exclamation points. The summer of 1879 was hot and long and full. Ruth grew larger and more capable of managing the heat than she had expected, and the hands treated her with the particular careful courtesy of working men who understand that a woman who has always been practical and strong is still deserving of consideration when she is carrying. Domingo brought her mangoes from the mercantile in town on a Saturday in July, which had apparently come up from Mexico and were an extraordinary luxury, and presented them with the dignity of a formal gift. Walt Dawson fixed a loose board on the cookhouse step, which she had not mentioned but he had noticed. Gideon was, in the months of that summer, quietly and completely present in a way that meant she was never asked whether she needed something. Instead, she looked up and found it already arranged. A chair brought to the shaded side of the garden. A second pillow. A later breakfast time agreed on without discussion, simply implemented. He did these things the way he did all things, without announcement or expectation of recognition, because doing them was simply what was right. She told him one evening in July that she had never in her life felt so consistently considered, and he looked genuinely puzzled, as though the concept of not doing these things was the foreign one. "You are my wife," he said. "You are carrying our child. What else would I do?" "Many things," she said. "Many men do many other things." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that's true," he said. "I'm sorry it's true." He looked at her with the directness that was particular to him. "I can only account for what I do." "You account for it very well," she said. Their son was born in October of 1879 as the cottonwood leaves turned yellow and the first cool air came down from the north. He arrived in the manner of first children, which is to say with considerable noise and effort, and the complete reorganization of everything that had seemed orderly until that moment. A woman from town named Mrs. Harker, who had attended more births than she could count, presided with calm authority. Gideon was outside the bedroom door for the entirety of the proceedings, which were lengthy, and the expression on his face when Mrs. Harker opened the door and told him he had a son was the most open thing Ruth had ever seen on a human face. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Ruth's arms with the concentrated awe of someone looking at something they cannot fully believe is real yet. The baby was red-faced and enormous-eyed and thoroughly himself already, with a cap of dark hair and his father's hands in miniature. "He's real," Gideon said, which was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said, but was entirely accurate. "He is very real," Ruth confirmed, and felt the kind of tired that is also complete. They named him James Thomas Bailey, James for Ruth's father and Thomas for Clara's son born in the spring, because family is made of threads both given and chosen, and the boy deserved to know both kinds were his. Clara came in November as she had promised, with baby Thomas in a basket and her husband Edward, who turned out to be a quiet, pleasant man who found Gideon immediately comprehensible in the way that certain men find each other comprehensible without requiring much explanation. They stayed for 2 weeks, and the main house was full in a way it had never been in its existence, which Ruth found she loved with a completeness that surprised her. Clara held James with the practiced ease of someone who had spent the past months learning the weight and language of an infant, and looked at Ruth over his head with an expression of such genuine happiness that Ruth had to look away for a moment. "I told Gideon he needed someone sensible," Clara said. "I did not anticipate someone this specifically right." "I came to cook," Ruth said. "You came to stay," Clara said firmly, and kissed the top of James's dark-haired head. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the mildest Texas had seen in several years, and the garden that Ruth had expanded and planned came through in better condition than expected. The apple trees survived their first winter in good health, and when spring came again and Ruth walked the garden rows in the early morning while James slept, she found the first asparagus spears breaking the surface of the soil exactly as she had known they would, persistent and reliable, returning, because the ground had been properly prepared for them. She stood in the early light of that April morning, listening to the ranch waking around her, the sound of the men in the bunkhouse, the horses in the barn, the cattle on the far range, and the sounds from the house where Gideon was beginning to move around in the early morning way she had learned to distinguish from all other sounds, the particular footstep and the particular routine of her particular person. He appeared at the garden gate with 2 cups of coffee, which had become a morning habit between them, the first quiet 15 minutes of the day before the work began. Ruth took her cup and they stood looking at the asparagus together. "First year," Gideon said. "1 more and it will be fully established," Ruth said, "and after that it will come back every spring without any help from us at all. Like most things worth planting," he said. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the asparagus with the small, satisfied expression he wore when a plan was working as intended, and she thought about the man in the stage stop notice in the San Antonio Ledger, who had seemed like a temporary solution to a temporary problem, and had turned out to be neither temporary nor a problem. "Gideon," he said, drinking his coffee. "I think we are going to need to think about a larger household again," she said. He turned to look at her. She watched the understanding arrive in his face, the same sequence she had seen in the garden the first time, and then the same expression, open and overwhelmed and entirely pleased. "Another 7 months," he said. "Approximately," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the same care he brought to every particular thing, and then he smiled, the real smile that changed the whole geography of his face. "I'll need a bigger notebook," he said. Ruth laughed, standing in her garden in the morning light of the ranch she had come to for 6 weeks and stayed for the rest of her life, and the sound of it carried over the fence and across the yard and out into the wide Texas morning, where the land lay open and patient around them, holding everything they were building the way good soil holds a root, firmly, and with the full intention of keeping it. Their second child arrived that October, a daughter this time, whom they named Eleanor after no one in particular, but because Ruth had always found the name to have a quality of solidity that suited her daughter from the first moment she held her. Eleanor was smaller than James had been, but no less determined, and she made her opinions clear on most subjects from the earliest possible opportunity. By the time Eleanor was a year old, James was walking with the aggressive forward momentum of a toddler who has somewhere to be and is not entirely sure where that is. And the Double B had expanded its herd and added a second vegetable bed behind the cookhouse, which now served the whole ranch in a more organized way, with Ruth managing the production and 2 of the permanent hands taking on delivery duties during the busy season. Domingo Reyes, now approaching 50, had become something like a beloved uncle to both children, a role he occupied with great dignity and the quiet pleasure of a man who had not expected to be needed in that way and found it suited him. He taught James the names of cattle in Spanish when the boy was old enough to begin learning language, and James retained them with the tenacity of a child who finds the sounds delightful. Walt Dawson retired from full ranch work in the spring of 1882 and moved to a small house in Granger's Hollow, but he came out to the Double B every Sunday for supper until the end of his life, and the chair at the corner of the table was considered his as a matter of general agreement. Gideon expanded the ranch's water infrastructure in 1882, digging 2 additional wells and extending the irrigation channel to the expanded garden, which had by that point grown to a size that could supply not only the ranch but a modest surplus that Ruth arranged to sell through the mercantile in town. The accounting for this enterprise was managed in a separate ledger, which Ruth kept with the same precision she brought to everything, and the proceeds went into a fund she described when Gideon asked, as the children's future. He had looked at her across the table and felt, as he had felt with increasing frequency since the morning she stepped off the stage in her best dress with her leather trunk and her practical chin, that he had narrowly avoided a great and specific loss by having the sense to put a notice in the San Antonio Ledger. He told her this one evening while they were sitting on the main house porch, which had become the seat of most of their important conversations, the children inside and asleep, the ranch quiet around them, the stars doing their excessive Texas thing in the sky above. "I think about the notice I put in the paper sometimes," he said. "I saw it in the ledger," Ruth said. "The second page, right column, it was businesslike." "I wrote it 4 times," he said. "The first 3 versions were longer. The fourth was the one that actually said what was necessary." "That is good editing," she said. "I was not thinking about editing. I was thinking about the ranch needing a cook." He looked at the stars. "I was not thinking about everything else." Ruth leaned her head back against the porch chair and looked at the stars too. "Neither was I," she said. "I was thinking about 6 weeks and fair wages." "And now," he said. She turned her head to look at him across the small space between their chairs, this man she had not been looking for, this land she had not intended to love, this life that had arrived sideways and taken up permanent residence. "Now I am thinking about the asparagus coming up in the spring," she said, "and whether James will be old enough to help plant the next row of beans, and whether Alina is going to inherit your stubbornness or mine, which I think is an open question at this point." "Those are good things to be thinking about," he said. "They are very good things," Ruth agreed. He reached across and took her hand in his in the dark, the same way he had taken it the night she said yes on this same porch, carefully and with complete intention, and they sat together in the October night of the Texas ranch that was theirs together, listening to the land that kept them and the lives they were still in the middle of making, which was exactly where they were supposed to be. The apple trees bore fruit in the fall of 1882, their 3rd year, just as the catalogs had promised. The harvest was modest but real, and Ruth made the first batch of apple preserves in the cookhouse that September, the same cookhouse where she had made biscuits on her first night and calculated 16 mouths to feed, and thought that 6 weeks was a manageable thing. James helped her stir the preserves on a stool beside the stove, with the focused seriousness of a 3-year-old being entrusted with an important task, and Alina sat in the corner in the small wooden chair that Gideon had made for her over the winter, looking at a picture book with the concentrated expression she had brought to everything since birth. Gideon came in from the yard in the late afternoon, smelling of horses and the outdoors, and looked at his family in the cookhouse where the window light was warm and the apple smell was extraordinary, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. "Papa," James said, not looking up from the stirring. "Preserves." "I can see that," Gideon said. "And smell it," Ruth said, glancing over her shoulder at him with the look she had for him specifically, direct and warm and entirely without pretension. He came in and sat at the small table in the corner, which was still her corner but also increasingly everyone's corner, and watched his family work, and thought about the notebook in his shirt pocket, and the things worth remembering, and how there were more of them than he could ever find time to write down, which was the very best kind of problem to have. Alina looked up from her picture book and pointed at the preserves pot with a decisiveness that was entirely her own. "I want some," she said. "When it cools," Ruth said. "Now," Alina said. "She has your stubbornness," Gideon told Ruth. "She has yours," Ruth said. "I have merely been more practiced at managing it." James dropped the stirring spoon. The pot sloshed. Gideon retrieved the spoon. Alina said now again, experimentally. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the organized, productive, frequently chaotic, entirely beloved scene in her kitchen and felt something that she did not try to put into words because words were insufficient for it. She had come here for 6 weeks. She had stayed for everything else. Outside the cookhouse window, the apple trees stood in the afternoon light with their first small harvest done, having taken root and grown, and become exactly what they had been planted to be. The garden fence that had been built on a Sunday afternoon to keep the rabbits out still stood at its original corners. The ranch land rolled outward in all directions under the wide sky, holding the cattle and the grass and the wells and the fence lines and all the small permanent things that make a place, and a life. Ruth Fletcher, who was Ruth Bailey, who had arrived with a leather trunk and $32, and a determination that no one should mistake for desperation, looked at all of it through the open cookhouse window and was, without qualification or reservation, entirely at home.